I really think we've seen this kind of across the current administration where issues are blurring, where the jurisdictional lines used to be much clearer.
Hello, and welcome to a very special episode of FDA Watch. We're the leading independent, nonpartisan podcast on FDA. I'm your host, Wayne Pines. I'm very excited about this episode. It's the first installment in one of our signature multi-episode series that we produce in collaboration with law firms and other organizations. Today's episode is first in a four-part series we're doing jointly with one of the truly renowned global food and drug law firms, Skadden. This four-part series is called FDA's Regulatory Revisions, Business and Legal Impact on Industry. And we're going to focus on the cutting-edge business and legal issues facing FDA-regulated industry in multiple sectors. You'll be hearing from legal experts at Skadden and other companies, and that journey begins today with a discussion of issues in the pharmaceutical and biologics area. So let's meet our guest. First up is Rachel Turow. Rachel is the head of Skadden's FDA regulatory practice. She has almost 2 decades of experience in food and drug law. She deals with a full range of FDA regulatory issues. Formerly, she was regulatory counsel at FDA, and she served as in-house counsel at many multinational companies. Welcome to FDA Watch, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Wayne. Really happy to be here.
Also joining us, Raquel Fox. Raquel is the head of Skadden's U.S. ESG practice, and she's co-head of the firm's SEC reporting and compliance practice. She previously spent 10 years at the Securities and Exchange Commission at the SEC. She held several positions, including serving as the director of the Office of International Affairs, senior advisor to the chairman, and senior special counsel to 2 directors in the Division of Corporation Finance. Her practice deals with capital markets, mergers, and acquisitions, among other things. Welcome to FDA Watch.
Thank you. Very happy to be here and looking forward to our discussion.
Next up is Kendall Ickes. She's an associate in Skadden's intellectual property and technology practice. She advises clients from a wide range of industries, including financial services and private equity, with a focus on the healthcare section and pharmaceuticals and biotechnology. She also provides intellectual property and technology-related support on M&A and secure financing transactions. Welcome to FDA Watch, Kendall.
Thanks, Wayne. Happy to be here.
Finally, Tess Cameron. Tess is a managing director on the venture team at RA Capital Management. She has also held finance leadership roles at Foghorn Therapeutics, Wave Life Sciences, and Biogen. Before joining biotech and pharma, she was a specialist in the corporate finance team at McKinsey & Company. Welcome to FDA Watch, Tess.
Thank you very much for having me. Look forward to our conversation.
So let me start here. It's now standard for FDA to establish new policies outside the traditional notice and comment process. There's great uncertainty about whether these requirements will endure and how companies should navigate in these uncertain times. There are several new policies that were established more or less informally, such as the decision to disclose complete response letters, or the commissioner's voucher program, or the decision to reduce the number of clinical trials required for drug approval from 2 to 1, or paid bonuses for reviewers. So I want to start with you, Rachel. How do you advise your clients to navigate in this time of uncertainty when these policies are not really established by regulation or even by guidance?
Thanks, Wayne. I think it's a really challenging thing because a lot of these policies make it much easier to bring drugs to market, right? That's their intention, is to speed the pathway to market and, as the commissioner often says, cut red tape. So, we see things, for example, the National Priority Voucher Program that the commissioner put out, which is, real benefit to companies in terms of being able to to secure a voucher, to have an expedited review in some cases. And a lot of companies, I think, are scrambling to try to figure out how to get one of these vouchers. But on the flip side, you have a situation where the program is not one that was, either negotiated as part of a user fee package, put out via notice and comment, the way FDA guidance usually is. And it's ephemeral in some sense of, how long is the program going to last? How many products is FDA going to accept into it? Is FDA going to terminate the program at any given time? And we're now kind of seeing some interesting questions being raised by, former FDA people about the impact on, FDA's review standard of a program like this. So I think it's a risk benefit calculus. In some cases, the getting a product to market faster is going to be worth the tenuous regulatory status of the program. And it's going to be worth it to companies to be in this program to get these drugs to market as fast as possible. For a company that's got a longer runway, it may not be the right choice because of the tenuous nature of the program. And I think there are unanswered questions that are definitely challenging to navigate, especially for a smaller company, for example, that might be a one product company. There may be regulatory risk associated with taking one of these expedited pathways that has not been introduced via a typical notice and comment process, because it is subject to challenge or subject to being withdrawn by FDA with very little notice. And so I think those are considerations that companies need to think about. And I'd be interested to hear if Tess has had conversations like this, thinking about these programs as well, because she deals with a lot of nascent companies and how they think through some of this.
Tess?
Absolutely. Very happy to add on here. So it is a really interesting and challenging time for early stage companies because they are heavily reliant on precedent and guidance from the FDA to have an understanding of what their path is going to be. And this is obviously a major focus of investors even very early on in an investment because the size, the probability of success, the cost to approval are obviously key factors that we consider whenever we're making an investment. And whenever those variables, there's a lot of probability that just comes down to science, right? But whenever those variables become less known, that can create an even greater range of outcomes. Now, sometimes that can shift to the positive, right? So I would point to the phase 3 guidance that the FDA published, where they said, okay, let's just have one trial as the default. All right, now that sounds pretty awesome, right? Like you have some indications, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, certain respiratory diseases, where you currently require these enormous phase 3 programs that are going to require probably like $500 million, if not more, to actually just fund that phase 3. And so you say, wow, like if I have an opportunity to cut that number in half, like that seems really cool, right? But then we go to what Rachel brought up, which is, yeah, but what is your p-value? Right? And has it really changed to the point where like just one trial is required and, your p-value is 0.05? Or is it like, no, one trial is required and the p-value is like 0.025, right? Because if it's the latter, shoot, now your sample size has to be a lot larger and maybe you've actually undone some of that, benefit of doing the one phase 3 trial. So all that to say, there's, a number of policies that sound potentially enabling and potentially beneficial to, early independent biotech companies. the devil is in the details, right? And we won't know if they're actually helpful and actually beneficial until we see some precedent where, we see a, study in ASCVD that is one trial and powered on a 0.05 alpha that where the company says that, the FDA was supportive of that, of that trial design, right? So I think we'll have to see case examples for several of these policies before we can really underwrite to, the benefits of these policies. So that's kind of one point. Another point that I would just make that you raised is this concept that there are, we are kind of getting information about how the FDA is going to, is planning to consider various approvals and various policies, not in the form of guidance documents, but rather in the form of, in the form of statements or in the form of tweets. And that can kind of further add, and this has been particularly challenging in the rare disease space, where that can kind of further add confusion about what is the bar and what is the standard that, companies should be designing their trials towards.
Let me ask Raquel and Kendall to comment from a more of a financial standpoint. How does a company plan? Right now, if the standard is one trial and you develop a budget, financial projections based on that, and then the ground shifts because you have a different reviewer, because you have different standards. How does that play out in today's environment?
It's a good question. I mean, I think like anything else with uncertainty comes risk. And so we're seeing smaller biotechs looking to partner their assets to try to share some of that risk with bigger players. And sometimes they're partnering earlier stage assets and sometimes at a discount, which big pharma is taking advantage of, especially in areas like oncology and GLP-1 adjacents. If it takes longer for review, that obviously increases costs because you're in the clinic for longer. There's the delay to launch. So I think partnerships are seeking to kind of reduce that risk for the smaller biotechs. But on the other hand, if we move forward with expedited reviews or only one pivotal trial, for example, that could really add more value to earlier stage assets that won't have to spend as much time in the clinic. So yeah, I think that the partnerships are a way for these biotechs to kind of offset some of that risk.
So how do you advise clients to navigate in this environment? What should a company comes to you and says, and this is a question for anyone who wants to address it, and says, gee, I'm not exactly sure how to develop my financials here because I don't know what the future may hold. I've got to develop a 5-year clinical program, and the FDA requirements may change. What do you advise your clients to do in today's environment?
Speaking from kind of the regulatory perspective, I think one of the most important things that I have found, especially in working on transactions, is being very transparent about the fact that these risks exist. I think one of the other things we're seeing, because I get to work across Skadden's platform, I see everything from deal to the litigation that results when the deal goes bad. And so, I think the speed, what Kendall was talking about is really important because there's large pharmaceutical companies where their R&D engine is really mostly smaller pharmaceutical companies. It's not, not every big pharma company is doing all their own R&D. There's a lot of licensing work that goes on, and it's very competitive. We've seen a lot of bidding wars in the past year. We've seen a lot of, companies that are really trying hard to get into a therapeutic area or make sure that they have, they need to buy a phase 3 asset, for example, because they're behind other companies. And those deals go very, very fast. And so some of these more nuanced risks, I think, can get lost in the pace of the deal making. And so I think from our perspective, it's very important to highlight that, that the environment that we're working in, there may be a lot of benefits, but there also these risks may exist, and that has to get built into the deal, either through the agreement. Sometimes it's not possible depending on what type of deal it is, but also through the valuation, and kind of working through that with partners, making sure that they know the risk they're taking on.
Yeah, I agree. And to add on to that, I would say I can expect that we might see in these type of licensing and collaboration deals a stronger focus on milestone payments for regulatory approvals and a lower upfront to try, for these licensees, these partners to offset that risk of a delay.
Let me move on to another topic. FDA's scope of responsibility seems to be shifting. I'm thinking specifically about the role of FDA in drug pricing. The most favored nation situation, using drug pricing as an incentive to get faster FDA review, the influence of the HHS secretary on FDA policy. I'd like to get your comments on how you feel about FDA's role in drug pricing and how that seems to be playing out these days.
I'm happy to offer a perspective on that one. Historically, we've really looked to payers as the arbiter of, what is the price at which drugs will get preferential coverage or maybe require a step through or a prior authorization. This is a very new position for the FDA to be in. And, what the FDA has been advocating for is the most favored nation policy that, the administration has also been, that the administration has been, advocating for and has some, policies, policies out. I think that look, it is at the end of the day a policy choice. I can share a lot of reasons why I think that policy choice is bad for innovation. The main one being that, when you think about the majority of drugs, most of their profits are going to come from the U.S. As soon as you add a policy like MFN, what you're doing is you're essentially shrinking the pie, right? Because what MFN means is that it won't be logical or profitable for many companies to launch outside the US, right? And so, if a drug might have earned $1 billion, and 300 million of that coming from Europe, now it would just earn $700 million, right? It's not like you can price higher in the US to compensate for, not being able to, launch outside of the US because of, low prices. It is simply that the opportunity is now smaller. And so that is not good for innovation. And so that is, at the end of the day, a policy decision where, certainly the administration has at its discretion many different agencies that can, in different ways, enforce that policy decision. But I have to say it was I think unusual and unexpected to have something like MFN tied to actually trying to withdraw drugs, right, and take drugs off of the market, or import drugs from Canada, or various other enforcement actions that. Are typically kind of in a, within a different purview, and it creates risk for companies if they are going to sign up for certain types of FDA programs, like the, priority review voucher, where. I think there's an open question of like, well, if you sign up for that voucher, that is obviously indicative of, a drug that should be a great drug. But what does it mean? You may have to give from a pricing standpoint, or from other meeting other policy objectives that may not necessarily be in the interests of may not necessarily be in the interest of the investors that kind of provided the capital that got you to that point. So those are, I think, open questions that remain for investors about the expanded scope of the FDA's remit to include things like drug pricing.
Rachel, I want to ask you about drug pricing. You come out of the FDA, you've got long experience there. What do you think about the FDA's starting to be engaged more in drug pricing? When I was at the FDA, we were trained not to be involved in drug pricing, not to consider that. That's obviously been changing.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right, Wayne. I think we've entered a new era where I really think we've seen this kind of across the current administration where issues are blurring, where the jurisdictional lines used to be much clearer. And, certainly same thing when I was at FDA, it was, drug pricing is well outside of the FDA's jurisdiction. Sometimes CMS would ask FDA for technical advice on certain things like some of their proposed rules. But overall, what CMS did was their business, and what FDA did was their business, and the two stayed very separate. I do think, what Tess brought up in terms of the MFN executive order that President Trump put out in May of 2025 actually said that FDA would consider withdrawing approval for drugs that did not acquiesce to the MFN pricing. And I think most of us who know FDA's regulations well found that to be a bit of a head scratcher, because I don't know where FDA has the authority to do that. But I think we are seeing the agency interpret its regulations in a very creative way in many different in ways throughout the different decisions they've made, in various policies that they've announced. So I think mostly MFN to me remains a huge open question, and FDA's role in MFN also remains an open question, because I don't think we really know how or if it's truly going to be implemented. But Tess raised a number of really important considerations. The comment period on the CMMI models just closed at the end of February, and there was pretty strong industry objection to the test pilots for Globe and Guard, which are the CMMI models, to implement MFN. But I also think there's an interesting question for Kendall here. There was an article today, actually, that I was reading about how MFN is changing licensing deals, and that licensing deals that were in existence prior to the announcement of this policy are now being kind of reconsidered. And I was wondering if Kendall has kind of seen that in her practice thus far.
Yeah, that's right, Rachel. Thanks for mentioning that. I think it's tough because when you have a ex-US commercial partner, and they might be able to launch ex-US prior to the US, the drug maker is saying, wait, hold up your launch. You might get a reference price that's lower than what we might get in the US, and the only way that I think commercial partners are finding a way that makes sense for them to comply with that kind of request is in exchange for royalty reductions that are commensurate with the price reduction in the US. So we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think you're going to get busier, Kendall.
I think so. Yeah, which is great.
Right. The world seems to be changing very, very quickly. But the main theme here is uncertainty and rapid change, and a lack of assurance that the policies that exist today are going to exist tomorrow. Is there anything special? Again, I'll open it up to anyone. In terms of the areas that you cover as attorneys, is there anything that companies need to change in the way that they approach the FDA world and the world of pharmaceutical development and the world of SEC disclosure? What do the companies need to do to respond to this new environment?
I will give one example. We see a lot of companies that are pursuing advice from multiple regulatory agencies in parallel. So it is not uncommon for us to meet with companies who are talking with the FDA at the same time they are talking with MHRA, at the same time they are talking with EMA. And this is they're doing this as a bit of a hedge on what might the FDA come back with in terms of additional requirements that they may have to pursue. That comes less from the any uncertainty about the top-down guidance that we've been talking about, and more because different companies are having different experiences with the understaffing at the FDA. And while the employees at the FDA, I think remain extremely committed, there are a number of senior roles that are, there are a number of senior officials who are very experienced who, are no longer at the FDA, who were kind of key consolidators of feedback and, could really help guide, a file in the right direction. In particular, if it was a modality that was more complex or an indication that was new where you had to, do thinking around an endpoint. And so what we see now in more of these situations is just companies that are going to multiple regulatory agencies in parallel and, seeing what feedback they get and basically saying, which regulatory agency can be the most helpful to them in advancing their program and providing feedback in a timely and constructive manner.
Yeah, I want to address the issue of staffing. There's certainly been significant changes in FDA staff, both in terms of numbers of people and in terms of the people themselves. How are the staffing levels and the people who have left FDA? How does that all affect the efficiency of the review process? I want to start with Rachel and then Tess on that, and let Kendall and Raquel comment.
Yeah, so I think in terms of the staffing, it really has been a roller coaster. We had a very large loss of employees right at the beginning of the Trump administration in April of last year. I can't believe that was almost a year ago. And there was a significant brain drain out of the agency. I mean, there is no question that many of the most experienced leaders left. And I think we're certainly seeing them now try to staff up again. My LinkedIn feed actually this week was full of people saying that they had just returned to the agency, which I thought was very interesting. But none at the senior levels. With the people who had done 1,000 reviews, and I do think we're seeing folks who are having to learn on the job, and that's really challenging, especially when there has been a lot of unprecedented interference from top leadership in a way that I don't think we've ever seen before at the application level. And so if you have a combination of inexperienced staff who, are very smart people, good at their jobs, but just, don't have the reps to kind of have done this a million times, and the uncertainty of not knowing what is going to trigger that kind of top level review, I think that's a very challenging environment in which to be giving regulatory advice like Tess was talking about.
Raquel, let's bring you in here. What about SEC disclosures? How does what we're talking about affect the disclosure requirements under the SEC laws?
Sure. So for public companies, they also have to consider mandatory quarterly, annual, and periodic disclosures and SEC reports. They also have to think about how they disclose these topics outside of SEC filings to investors, analysts, and other third parties. So kind of the good news is that the current SEC leadership is really focused on material disclosures, meaning information that investors will need to know in order to make an investment decision. So at the SEC, there's going to be kind of two sets of groups looking at these companies' disclosures. One is the Corp Fin staff who could issue a comment to the company about their disclosures. The other is the enforcement division who could bring civil actions against the company and individuals. So the SEC is closely monitoring these disclosures. So are investors. They also redline the disclosures, meaning it's easy to see what's changed from filing to filing. If you added a sentence, you changed a risk factor, you slightly tweak something. The SEC and, of course, investors, too, are also closely paying attention to any news stories and coverage. So they're not just looking at SEC filings in order to provide feedback. So when a company is making disclosures in SEC filings, I also think it's important for them to think about the tone of the disclosures, particularly in this kind of political and sort of changing environment that we're in. You don't want to make a disclosure that's going to set off unnecessary alarm bells with the FDA or other regulators. So, but with respect to SEC filings and disclosure, I'll talk about kind of 5 top things to keep in mind. The first one is risk factors. Given this changing environment, risk factors can really be a company's friend. It serves as an insurance policy for litigation. So bringing in new risk factors and thinking about whether you need to add risk due to all of these things that we've been talking about, whether the current risk factors that a company has now read as hypothetical, even though the risk has now actually occurred. That's something the SEC has brought litigation to companies for. Another area is forward-looking statements. So especially when we don't know kind of what's going to happen, providing really careful, tailored forward-looking statements can help lower the risk of private litigation, like calling out FDA regulations, where you sit in trials, those types of things. The regulatory section. It's important to have a cross-functional team reviewing this section, giving all the changes that are going on. So it can't just be your lawyers. You need to have, probably folks on the ground looking at trials, making sure that they are reviewing this section. The fourth area, management's discussion and analysis. In SEC reports, this is where it's supposed to be thought of as telling the story through the eyes of management, and also making sure that any material known trends and uncertainties are highlighted in this section. And the last one, fifth one, and a super important one, is thinking about material non-public information. So the company may be having conversations with the FDA and other regulators that aren't made public yet. The SEC has very sophisticated tools to track suspicious trading around material non-public information. So thinking about, one, regulation fair disclosure, which is supposed to level the playing field between what the company knows, analyst knows, and others. So making sure that the company isn't selectively disclosing information to analysts or other people who may trade on the information. So you hear something new from the FDA, you can't just tell one analyst about it, that if it's material, that wouldn't be good. The other thing is insider trading. If you know information that's not yet material, making sure that employees aren't trading on this information or tipping their friends, family, and others off to it. This can also extend to information that you learned about customers or other business deals that the company is doing. And then something that's come up a lot more recently is the prediction markets. I would say employees really shouldn't be using the company's confidential information that they learned through their job for their own personal benefit in trading in prediction markets ahead of making that information material. This type of conduct is likely covered by the company's code of conduct or ethics, but I think that's an area that we'll likely see a lot more attention to as well.
In the last year, since this administration has come in, has there been a change in the way that you approach the SEC disclosures because of the uncertainty of some of the policies?
Yes. I mean, I think what we're doing is making sure that we have risk factors that cover the level of uncertainty, and making clear that making sure things aren't written in stone, that it shows that there's some level of uncertainty there, and making sure that investors understand what that uncertainty means in terms of their investment in the company. And then, Rachel, I know we've had some specific kind of examples lately. Do you want to talk about those?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've had quite a few adventures and intersections between FDA's new policies and SEC disclosures. It seems to come up a lot. Especially with, I think there's a couple of areas. One is especially around the new CRL policy. I think we've had a number of questions come up around how do companies need to change the way they're making disclosures for programs if they know that the CRL will eventually become public if they get one. I think there's been, it was interesting to me when FDA announced that program that one of the reasons that they felt they needed to make CRLs public was for investors. And, I think that's interesting it's interesting, number one, that FDA thought they needed to take on that role, but number two, kind of what does that mean for investors and disclosures?
And so we wrote, and with Rachel's kind of lead, we wrote an article about this. But in practice, what we've seen that is it's meant really accelerated disclosures by companies. So sooner than they probably typically would have made disclosures. Of course, the company needs to assess the materiality when they're making these disclosures, and also think about what level of detail they want to get into in their public disclosures. But they should assume that investors are going to ask them about these CRLs, and that the SEC may also be, abreast of those too. But so for companies, it's really thinking about when, where, and how they're going to talk about the CRLs. Is it going to be in an SEC filing? Is it going to be in a press release? So really kind of, and also thinking about that ahead of time and before it happens. So being ready.
I used to think that it was almost impossible for a company to not know they were going to get a CRL because there were so many signals, right? You would kind of know that the agency was working its way up to it. But these days, that's not necessarily the case anymore. I think we've seen a couple of examples recently where companies were shocked to get a CRL, which is really challenging, I think, from a disclosure standpoint.
And then too, Rachel, just and Wayne, thinking about the informal FDA policies. Rachel, you want to set that up, and then I can talk about what it means for the SEC disclosure?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question, Raquel. The idea that what we talked about at the beginning of the episode, in that a lot of the policies that FDA has brought about in the current administration, things like these priority vouchers, changing the number of clinical trials required from 2 to 1. They're offering, bonuses for faster reviews. They, are all these kind of ephemeral policies that may or may not stick around. And from a disclosure standpoint, I thought what you talked about, especially with risk factors, is really, really important. But how do you characterize these kinds of regulatory, advantages if you don't really know that they are set in stone?
Rachel, that's a great question. I want to take a quick break now and address that very question when we come back from break. And we're back. We're talking to Rachel Turow, Kendall Ickes, and Raquel Fox from Skadden, and Tess Cameron from RA Capital Management. Rachel, let me urge you to ask your question again, and let's talk about it. What kind of disclosures?
Yeah, Raquel, I'd love to hear more from you about kind of how you would advise people to navigate, with a more ephemeral policymaking from FDA, even if they feel it's an advantage. How do you kind of characterize that in your filings?
So, Rachel, you mentioned the risk factor section, which I said was an insurance policy. I'll stick with that. But I also think just making sure that in your disclosures, or in the company's disclosures, they're not definitive about the timing or the outcome of these scenarios. And Tess used a really great descriptor earlier, which was hedging. And I think that the disclosure really has to hedge what's going to happen, and of course, making sure that they're keeping in mind the tone of how they're talking about it, and also that they're going to have a varied audience. So it's not just investors; it's also FDA, SEC, and others. And then, with respect to just having these informal policies, again, potentially having a PR firm in the background ready to go. So if something unexpected comes, you're not reaching out to that PR firm for the very first time. They understand your business and they know the kind of dilemmas that you may face. But again, for SEC, risk factors, forward-looking statements, and then the regulatory section should help you set these scenarios up nicely.
And again, I'm going to ask the same question I asked before. Is the challenge more acute these days than it was a year ago? That is, has the current environment changed the way that companies need to address these disclosure requirements?
I would say yes. I mean, overall, the disclosure requirements themselves have not changed at all over the past year. I think it's really just what we've seen on the ground at the FDA in terms of informal policies, changes with personnel, even the FDA actually calling out certain companies by name in interviews or on social media or otherwise. That's caused companies to really take a closer look at their disclosures, how they respond, and how they're framing their business and their regulatory risks.
And has the mechanism of disclosure changed?
Well, I think it's still kind of like mechanisms are the same. I think it may be more frequent now than it used to be, disclosing earlier than it used to be. And also, unfortunately now, some companies are now on the defensive and they've had to be reactive in a very quick manner, which before it was kind of like the companies had a good sense of the timing and they knew when they would likely disclose and how, as opposed to, you may wake up to a new notice or something that you weren't expecting and have to quickly react to that.
Let me turn now to how companies talk about product development in the context of the deals that they're making. Has this new environment made investors more cautious in thinking about deals with clinical stage companies and assets? And what are the kinds of protection and assurances that buyers are looking for in the deal context?
I'm happy to comment on that. I think that it really depends on the disease, right? And whether there is a well kind of trodden and established path for that indication. And I would actually say it's much less about is the company clinical stage than just is the company early stage, right? In some ways, a company that has a phase 3 in flight for a well-known indication is much less riskier than a company that has to set forward a new path in, an indication where they're going to require a lot more feedback from the FDA on what the bar is in order to move forward. So that latter investment, that was always kind of a riskier investment, right? But I just think that that risk is probably amplified at this point. So I think it's very disease and very context dependent. Certainly having to come up with a new endpoint or, coming up with a new, clinical trial path and saying like, hey, we're just going to, try this one trial thing and kind of see how it goes. Like, of course, very few companies would actually do that without, having a discussion and getting feedback on whether that was appropriate. But I think it's very disease dependent. I would say the biggest area of uncertainty for companies now is within the rare disease space, where there has been a lot of discussion about regulatory flexibility, but we haven't actually seen a lot of that regulatory, flexibility play out, at least in terms of, a number of companies that have communicated alignment with the FDA that then did not have alignment with the FDA when they went forward, and actually submitted data or discussed the data that they were going to submit with the FDA. So I think that is the area that has really been impacted the most is the rare disease space and that kind of assumption of, regulatory flexibility and what do you need to show has, really, I think there's a lot more questions about what that bar is now. And that is actually a bigger risk, for companies that have an agreed upon trial design where they haven't necessarily had input from the highest levels, right? Because the reasonable question to ask is like, okay, so the review group that you talked to said that this path was okay, but like, is FDA leadership okay with it? There currently isn't really, always a mechanism for getting that level of feedback.
We have time for one more question. We're talking about what businesses should be thinking about in this new FDA era. But I want you to wrap up. What are the things, let me ask you this. What is the singular thing that businesses need to think about in navigating this environment? Let me start with Rachel and then turn to Kendall and then Raquel. What is the singular thing that your clients need to think about in navigating this environment?
I think from a regulatory perspective, for companies that are trying to get their products through FDA, things are not business as usual anymore. And so I really loved what Raquel said about having a crisis communications person on hand when you're thinking about your disclosures. I think it's the same idea when you're going through a regulatory process where you need to have a full cross-sectional team, including government affairs, including communications. It is no longer just a science-based exercise anymore, and companies have to adjust to make sure that they can deal with the current FDA environment.
Kendall, from your perspective?
From a transactional perspective, I think the net effect of this regulatory uncertainty is a market that is deal making despite and in some ways because of this regulatory turbulence. And so I think we're going to see regulatory clarity or lack thereof play a much bigger role in how these deals are priced and just making sure you're thinking about that. Our clients are thinking about that from whichever side of the table they sit on, whether that's as a smaller biotech or the big pharma license.
Raquel, final word.
So given that things are quickly changing, it's understanding what's material with those changing circumstances. And if you need to quickly get out something to investors to update them about new scenarios, how you're going to do that, when and where. And then, of course, not selectively disclosing that to certain analysts without telling the fuller public, and also not using that non-public information to your own advantage in prediction markets or trading or otherwise.
Okay, on that note, it's time to thank our guests, Rachel, Kendall, Raquel, and Tess, for being so articulate in explaining the business implications of what's going on at FDA. It was a great start to this 4-part series that we're doing in collaboration with Skadden. I want to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Evan Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. I want to remind everybody that if you want information about the podcast, if you want to subscribe, if you have not already, go to fdawatch.net. I'll repeat that, fdawatch.net. And we know you don't want to miss parts 2, 3, and 4 of this series or any episode. And I repeat, the only way to do that is to subscribe, fdawatch.net. It's free and it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. And as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to know what FDA is doing, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.